I was sitting at the edge of my dock just after sunrise, coffee still warm in my hand, watching the mist slide slowly across the surface of the lake. It was one of those mornings that feels untouched by the world. No engines, no voices, just water, birds, and the soft creak of old wood beneath my feet. I'd lived on this land long enough to recognize true quiet, and that morning had it. Then I heard sirens, not distant ones, not something passing on the highway. These were close, sharp, and coming fast, straight down my private gravel driveway. My first thought was that something terrible had happened. You don't hear police sirens that early unless someone's hurt or something's gone very wrong. I stood up, heart beating faster than it should have, and watched two police SUVs roll in and stop in front of my house. Doors opened. Radios crackled. And standing behind them, wearing a blazer that looked out of place next to dirt and water, was a woman I already recognized. Karen. She wasn't smiling, but she looked satisfied, like someone who finally got the moment they'd been waiting for. By the end of that same day, the HOA she represented would be legally paying me to use the lake they claimed they controlled. But standing there barefoot on my dock, confused and irritated, I had no idea how far Karen was about to push things. This lake wasn't a bonus feature. It wasn't a shared amenity. It wasn't decorative water behind a development sign. This lake was family. My grandfather bought the land in the early 70s, long before anyone thought about building houses out here. Back then it was cheap because nobody wanted it. Too much mud, too many trees, too far from town. He cleared it himself, dug out the shoreline, and built the first dock with his own hands and a borrowed toolbox. It wasn't pretty, but it was solid, and it lasted longer than most things do these days. I grew up fishing here, learned how to tie knots, how to move slow around water, how to respect land that gives you peace. When the property passed to me, I didn't change much. I repaired what needed repairing and left the rest alone. No parties, no crowds, no noise. Just a quiet life that stayed well within the law. For years, nothing disturbed that balance. Then the development started. At first, it was just one house on the far side of the lake. Expensive, clean, clearly planned. Then another. Then suddenly the other shoreline began transforming into manicured grass, identical docks, and signs advertising lakefront luxury. With the houses came regular traffic, boats, and people who treated the water like it was an accessory. A homeowners association followed soon after. Flyers appeared in mailboxes, notices about meetings, talks of standards and uniform appearance. I ignored all of it because it didn't apply to me. My land wasn't part of the development. It never had been. The boundary lines were clear, and anyone who cared to check could see that. Most people did check. Karen didn't. She showed up one afternoon while I was repairing part of the dock. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses perfectly placed, expression friendly in that tense, forced way. She introduced herself as the HOA president and started asking questions. How often I used the lake. Whether I planned any upgrades. If I'd be open to coordination. That word stood out. I answered politely but cautiously. Years teach you when someone's gathering information instead of making conversation. When she mentioned making sure everyone followed the same lake rules, I told her calmly that I wasn't part of the HOA. Her smile froze just slightly. She said, "Oh, I think everyone around the lake is included." I corrected her. Explained that my property was privately owned long before the development existed. That the lake wasn't governed by HOA rules. That everything I did here was legal. She didn't argue. She nodded, wrote something down and said, "We'll verify that. People who say that never like what they find." 2 weeks later, I got my first letter. It claimed my dock violated HOA appearance standards. I laughed and tossed it aside. The second letter warned me about unapproved lake structures. I stopped laughing. The third letter included a fine, addressed incorrectly, and referenced rules that didn't even apply to my county. That was when I realized Karen wasn't checking facts. She was pushing forward, assuming pressure would make me comply. I didn't respond. I documented everything. Then came the morning with the police. One officer approached me while Karen stood close behind, talking fast and loud about complaints, safety concerns, and unauthorized construction. I let her speak. I've learned people like her reveal more than they intend to when you don't interrupt. When the officer finally asked for my side, I said one calm sentence. This isn't an HOA lake." There was a pause. The officer asked Karen if that was accurate. She redirected, avoided, and claimed they were still confirming boundaries. I went inside and returned with my deed, survey maps, and shoreline documentation. The officer studied them carefully. Karen stopped talking. The officer made a call, stepped away, and waited. Karen shifted her weight, adjusted her blazer, and tried to reframe the situation. She said she was only concerned about safety, about standards, about protecting property values. The officer listened politely, but his attention stayed on the paperwork in his hands. When he came back, his tone had changed. The lake wasn't HOA property. The development stopped at the shoreline. Always had. My dock was legal, grandfathered, and well within code. The police weren't there for me. They were there because someone had exaggerated a complaint and involved emergency services without justification. Karen's expression didn't explode. It tightened. The officers left with a warning, for her. As they drove away, she stood there longer than necessary, staring at the lake like it had personally insulted her. She finally said, "This isn't over." I believed her. What followed wasn't loud, it was constant. Letters phrased like concerns, emails sent to county offices, HOA board members walking near my shoreline, taking photos from angles that suggested authority they didn't have. One man even stepped onto my dock until a small sign I installed, backed by cameras, made him think better of it. That's when it became clear this wasn't about safety or rules. It was about control. Karen couldn't stand that something near her development existed beyond her reach. The idea that the lake didn't answer to her authority ate at her. So she started telling residents the lake was basically shared. That one word did a lot of damage. Boats drifted closer to my side. Temporary markers appeared where they didn't belong. Assumptions replaced legality. I didn't confront anyone. I researched. Late. Evenings turned into hours of reading old records my grandfather kept. Water rights, shoreline access, dock authority. Everything was documented cleanly and clearly. The law was on my side in ways Karen never bothered to investigate. And in pushing as hard as she had, she gave me something valuable. Options. For the first time since this started, I wasn't reacting. I was thinking ahead. Planning steps that didn't break rules, didn't escalate publicly, and didn't give her ammunition. By the time Karen realized she had crossed from pressure into liability, it was already too late to step back. She thought she was cornering me. She had actually handed me control. Once Karen realized the police weren't going to do her job for her, she changed strategies. Instead of loud confrontations, everything became quieter and somehow more intrusive. I stopped receiving direct threats and started getting notices that looked official enough to make people nervous but vague enough to deny later. Letters from the HOA talked about ongoing boundary clarification. Emails mentioned temporary usage expectations. None of it directly stated ownership, but the implication was always there. They wanted people to assume the lake was community adjacent, community regulated, and therefore subject to their oversight. Karen knew that if enough residents believed it, pressure would do the rest. I noticed the change around the lake almost immediately. Boats that used to keep a respectful distance drifted closer to my shoreline. People I didn't recognize lingered longer than necessary near my dock. A couple even waved casually, as if familiarity alone granted access. I waved back not because I welcomed it, but because acknowledging someone calmly often confuses them more than confrontation. Still, I documented everything. Dates, times, license numbers, small things most people dismiss until they add up. Because I didn't yell or react publicly, Karen grew bolder. HOA volunteers started scheduling walks along the lake perimeter, conveniently stopping just short of trespassing while clearly inspecting my side. Photos were taken, notes were written. One afternoon, I overheard someone say, "I heard the lake's basically shared now." Basically, that word again. That was when I understood Karen wasn't trying to prove ownership anymore. She was trying to create it through repetition. If enough people believed the lake belonged to everyone, she could claim confusion later. Mistakes happen, misunderstandings, that sort of thing. Then the complaints started reaching the county. Someone reported loud activity on my dock. Another claimed environmental concerns related to runoff. A third suggested unpermitted modifications, even though nothing had changed in years. Inspectors showed up politely, asked questions, took notes, and left when everything checked out. Each visit cost Karen credibility she didn't seem to notice slipping away. But frustration has a way of making people reckless. During one HOA meeting, one I wasn't invited to but heard plenty about afterward, Karen apparently stood up and announced that unrestricted lake access was a community right. That statement alone was dangerous, not just inaccurate but actionable. Within days, the shoreline felt different. Markers appeared near the water that hadn't been there before. Temporary ropes, small signs about shared use. None of it touched my property directly, but it edged closer each time, like testing how far they could go without crossing a legal line. That's when someone finally crossed it. I came out one evening to find 2 HOA board members standing on my dock, measuring tape in hand. Neither looked embarrassed. One even smiled as if we were neighbors borrowing sugar. I didn't raise my voice. I asked them to leave. I informed them they were trespassing. They laughed and said Karen said it was fine. Cameras don't laugh. They left quickly once they realized everything had been recorded. That incident forced my hand. Not emotionally, strategically. I stopped assuming Karen would back down once she realized she was wrong. She wasn't wrong in her mind, she was entitled, and entitlement doesn't respond to reason. So I escalated legally. I contacted an attorney who specialized in property and water rights. I brought everything. Deeds, surveys, recordings, letters, photos. Old documents my grandfather had saved like he knew someday they'd matter. The lawyer didn't need long. He leaned back, looked at me, and said, "They don't own the lake. They never did." That wasn't the surprise. What surprised me was hearing how many protections I had that Karen hadn't even considered. Shoreline control, dock authority, liability exposure for unauthorized access. The longer she encouraged people to use water she had no right to govern, the more risk she created for the HOA, and risk makes boards nervous. That's when the power started shifting. Karen didn't know it yet, but every action she'd taken to control me had quietly built a legal case against her. Not aggressive, not dramatic, just thorough. I left that meeting calmer than I'd been in weeks, because for the first time since this began, I wasn't responding to pressure. I was holding leverage. Karen sensed the change before she understood it. The letters slowed. The emails became cautious. Phrases like "under review" replaced demands. HOA board members stopped walking near my shoreline. Meetings behind closed doors grew longer. People started asking questions Karen couldn't answer cleanly, without exposing how far she'd overstepped. That's when she lost control. She showed up unannounced one afternoon. On while I was down by the water, this time without her clipboard. No polite introductions, no fake smile. Just frustration leaking through every word. She accused me of selfishness, of hogging a shared resource, of refusing to be cooperative. I listened until she ran out of steam, and then calmly told her my attorney would handle further communication. That sent her spiraling. She raised her voice, claimed the HOA would handle it internally, threatened community pressure. None of it landed, because threats without authority are just noise. Still, she left furious, and furious people rarely make good decisions. Within days, she made one. She sent out a mass email to residents stating that lake access would continue pending clarification. My lawyer loved that message, because pending clarification implied uncertainty, and uncertainty creates liability. If someone got hurt using the lake under a false assumption, the HOA could be responsible. That email alone forced the board to finally look at the documents Karen had avoided. What they found wasn't subtle. Ownership stopped at the shoreline. Water access belonged exclusively to me. Any use beyond visual enjoyment required my permission. The HOA had no standing to regulate, charge for, or authorize lake use. Karen tried to argue semantics. The board argued risk. That meeting didn't end quietly. Over the next week, Karen's authority eroded in public. Board members contradicted her. Residents questioned her guidance. The same people who had once nodded politely started distancing themselves. Control only works as long as people believe you have it. She didn't. In a last attempt to reassert dominance, Karen tried to block access to the water from her side of the development, claiming it was temporary. Residents pushed back. They asked why access was being changed if the HOA didn't even own the lake. Karen had no answer that didn't involve admitting she'd been wrong. That When the HOA's attorneys reached out to mine. The tone was different, careful, respectful, interested in resolution. They wanted to know my intentions. I told them the truth. I had no interest in conflict. I wanted clarity, boundaries, and control over my property. Nothing more, nothing less. But clarity comes with conditions. If the HOA wanted continued access to the lake, it would be through a legal agreement, structured, controlled, paid. Karen hated that idea, because it meant losing face. A dock, something simple, legal, and entirely within my rights, would give me the ability to grant or deny access formally. It would remove ambiguity, and ambiguity was the only thing keeping Karen relevant. Construction plans were drafted, permits filed, environmental approvals secured, everything clean, everything compliant. Karen tried to interfere again, but this time her emails went unanswered. Her complaints redirected, her authority replaced by counsel. Watching someone who thrives on control lose it piece by piece is strange. There was no explosive moment, just quiet realization settling in. She had pushed too hard, and in doing so she'd given me the opportunity to define the terms. By the time the dock work began, the HOA had a choice: get nothing, or negotiate. And for the first time since this story started, Karen wasn't writing the rules. She was subject to them. By the time construction equipment arrived near the shoreline, the atmosphere around the lake had completely changed. What used to feel like low-level harassment now felt like quiet spectatorship. People watched from a distance. Phones came out. Conversations stopped when I walked by. Everyone knew something was happening. They just didn't know how it would end. The dock wasn't a surprise. Every permit was approved. Every boundary was double-checked. Environmental compliance was handled to the letter. I wasn't building anything flashy, just something functional, solid, and well within my rights. But what the dock represented mattered far more than what it was made of. It established control. A clearly defined access point meant clearly defined permission. No assumptions, no basically shared. Either you had authorization, or you didn't. Karen found out about the dock 2 days after construction began. Not through me, through the HOA's attorney, who forwarded the notice as a formality. By then her involvement was mostly symbolic. Authority had shifted, even if she hadn't accepted it yet. She stormed over that same afternoon. This time, there was no clipboard, no forced courtesy, just raw frustration. She accused me of trying to monetize the community, said I was creating division, claimed I'd caused unnecessary panic among residents. I let her finish. Then I told her calmly that any future communication should go through the attorneys, that my decisions were legal, documented, and protected, and that the dock was happening, with or without her approval. Her voice rose. Mine didn't. That contrast mattered more than anything I said, because people were watching. Even some HOA board members were present, standing awkwardly off to the side. They didn't step in. They didn't back her up. For the first time since I'd met her, Karen was alone. She left without saying another word. Construction continued uninterrupted. As the dock took shape, something unexpected happened. Residents began asking questions, not demanding access, just asking politely. They wanted to understand what was changing, what was allowed, what wasn't. That shift told me everything I needed to know. Authority had moved. The HOA board reached out formally a few days later. Their message was careful and professional. They acknowledged the lake's ownership, acknowledged misuse of language in past communications, and then they asked the question Karen never wanted to hear. Asked, what would it take for the HOA to retain any access to the lake? The answer was simple: a legal agreement, defined hours, clear limits, liability coverage, and compensation. No emotional charge, no revenge, just structure. The board hesitated, not because the idea was unreasonable, but because accepting it meant acknowledging Karen's mistake publicly. It also meant admitting that the HOA had operated outside its authority. Boards hate that, but reality doesn't negotiate with pride. Their attorneys confirmed what mine already knew. Without an agreement, the HOA had no legal access. And the dock meant I now controlled the safest, most practical entry point. Anything else increased their liability significantly. Within a week, negotiations started. Karen was technically present, but silent. Her role had shifted from leader to observer, and she hated it. Any time she tried to interject, she was shut down politely by council. Facts have a way of doing that. The final agreement was clear. The HOA would pay a monthly fee for limited access, usage would be restricted to specific times, maintenance responsibilities would be shared under defined terms. Any violation would immediately suspend access. And most importantly, ownership and authority were officially recognized. Karen signed last. She didn't look at anyone while doing it. The dock was finished shortly after, clean lines, solid construction, nothing extravagant. But it transformed the shoreline from a point of conflict into a boundary of clarity. People adjusted quickly. There were no more assumptions, no wandering boats, no random visitors near my side of the lake. Residents who wanted access followed the rules. Those who didn't come at all. And Karen? She vanished. No emails, no confrontations, no surprise visits, just silence. In the weeks that followed, the lake settled back into something familiar, but better organized. Peace returned, not because people were afraid to cross lines, but because the lines were finally visible. The HOA stopped issuing notices about the water. Meetings moved on to other topics. Residents adapted to the new normal without much resistance. In truth, most of them had never wanted conflict in the first place. They just wanted clarity, and now they had it. Karen officially stepped down as HOA president less than 2 months later. No dramatic announcement, no apology, just a brief message buried in a community update citing personal reasons. The board appointed a replacement who immediately emphasized cooperation and transparency. That told me everything I needed to know. Power changes quietly when handled correctly. Occasionally, someone would ask me if it was worth it. The stress, the paperwork, the months of tension. And the honest answer was yes, but not for the reason they expected. It wasn't about money. The HOA fees covered maintenance and then some, but it was never about profit. It was about protecting something that mattered and refusing to be pressured into surrendering it just because someone thought authority was something you could declare out loud and make real. I didn't beat anyone. I didn't embarrass Karen publicly. I didn't escalate emotionally. I let facts, documentation, and patience do the work. And that's what made it effective. Looking back, the warning signs were always there. Karen spoke in certainty without understanding. She assumed control without jurisdiction. She treated quiet people like they were passive until proven otherwise. But quiet doesn't mean weak. The dock still stands today, unchanged. People use it respectfully. Rules are followed without argument. And every now and then, early in the morning, when the lake is calm and the air is still, I sit where this all started, with a cup of coffee and the sound of water moving gently against the woo. No sirens, no letters, no assumptions, just clarity. If there's a lesson in all this, it's a simple one. Authority doesn't come from titles, clipboards, or loud confidence. It comes from understanding what's actually yours and knowing how to protect it calmly when someone tries to take it. Karen tried to control something she never owned, and in doing so, she lost control of everything else.